Hello, it's Justin Johnson. I'm a representative of Social Science and Arts faculty. I'm on the module DD211. Understanding politics, institutions, ideas in the modern world. The book is edited by Geoff Andrews, Angus Shijaki, Andy O'Kane, Rhea Pavokanik, and Dan Taylor. The book was first published in wait a minute, Milton Hall, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes, Abbey University, 2015, edition 2022. Chapter 8, Sovereignty, page 254. Bear with me, I'm going to influence youth today. Young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. Keep them methodical in practice. Chapter 8, Sovereignty. Throughout the world, this led the United Nations to declare that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. United Nations, 1960. While most would concur that the Declaration contains a laudable aspiration in general, the problems of peoples freely determining their political status were brought starkly into view during the 1990s with the protracted crisis that tore apart what was then Yugoslavia, and in particular Bosnia and Kosovo. This struggle brought the brutal practice of ethnic cleansing to international attention, wherein whole populations were expelled from certain areas in order to bring the cultural populations in line with the imagined boundaries of the new state. There are, of course, examples of more peaceful movements that have established claims through more democratic means, such as in Scotland in the UK and in Quebec in Canada. However, even with some established liberal democratic countries, the idea of self defined peoples freely determining their political status raises serious potential for conflict, such as questions over the status of Catalonia and the Basque country in Spain. Here, popular movements are actively advocating secession in order to set up their own sovereign states, a position which is rejected outright by the government of Spain. The concern on all sides is that if these regions were to declare independence, civil unrest could follow. Second challenge from below comes from virtual space. Manuel Castells insists that the rise of what he terms the network society has and will continue to radically shift people's identities and loyalties into coming decades. Castells, 1996. He contends that the new virtual space created by internet do not fit with the rigidities of territorially based communities. Castell argues that the ability of these technologies to freely connect people in constantly innovative and borderless communities will herald a new form of sovereignty based on virtual space. The Arab Spring in the generic name given to the numerous uprisings of people against the authoritarian regimes in North Africa and in the Middle East from 2010 on. In terms of the three levels outlined earlier of government, state, and sovereignty, such uprisings sought to or were seen by governments as seeking to undermine the very sovereignty settlement of the country. The Arab Spring disturbances and commonly held to have been driven in part to the availability of cheap technologies like mobile phones that allowed networks of dissent to develop. These networks were formed by disparate individuals from different groups joining together in common cause to organise protests and to distribute images and propaganda to further their cause and help overthrow their rulers. It is certainly the case that the new possibilities have emerged in recent decades that have posed fundamental challenges to the ability of nation state to control the flows of information internally. However, many governments are seeking to counter that challenge in their efforts to restabilise the existing sovereignty settlement. Often governments simply turn off the tap and close down the interest, thus disabling the network at source. This was borne out during the Arab Spring, when governments, notably in Egypt, Bahrain, and Syria, periodically shut down this potent form of dissent. In more recent years, governments across the world have imposed temporary social media of internet blackouts, including Pakistan, India, Sudan, Ethiopia, Belarus, Cuba, Venezuela, Myanmar, and others. While some proactive citizens can get around this using virtual private networks, VPNs, in China, the government has created a vast, sophisticated, and permanent censorship operation that blocks websites such as YouTube, Google, Wikipedia, and the BBC, and heavily restricts what individuals can access. The case of Edward Snowden reveals the extent of which Western governments are also perturbed by the rise of this new space and are therefore anxious to own the internet and all the information in it. In 2013, Snowden surreptitiously downloaded data from the US National Security Agency, NSA, in order to expose the extent to which certain nation states, the US and UK in particular, are eavesdropping on their citizens' phone conversations, web browsing, emails, and social media exchanges. In recent years, there have been similar scandals involving private companies with links to politicians. Consider the Cambridge Analytica scandal of 2018, in which Christopher Wiley, a former employee and whistleblower, revealed how the data company harvested the personal data of millions of Facebook users without their consent in order to develop personalized political advertising, like that used to be used by the Vote Leave campaign during the Brexit referendum and the 2016 presidential election campaign of Donald Trump. It is clear from the reactions of these revelations that all governments are probably to some extent seeking to stem access to information that they perceive as threatening to their authority. When it comes to new technology and virtual spaces, governments are certainly often found to be playing catch-up to networks of dissent in this regard. Whether these new spaces pose a fundamental threat to the established system of sovereignty is still open to debate at this stage. This section has discussed challenges to the sovereignty of the nation state. Perhaps these examples raise more questions than they close down in terms of whether sovereignty is slipping away from the state. But what they do reveal is that sovereignty is not a closed concept. It is rather fluid and dynamic, open to various challenges and interpretations as such. Sovereignty is a fundamental political concept. In their conclusion on page 257, sovereignty is understood as a claim to act for over and over community without challenge. Sovereignty underpins the legitimacy of the modern nation state. It can be conceived in legal terms as de jure sovereignty and practically in terms of availability to express de facto power, both within the state and externally. The concept provides fundamental basis of national political systems. A sovereignty settlement reflects the legitimate authority of the relationship between a territory, a people, and a government. The idea of a social contract between the government and the people is often used to emphasize that the people's consent to their being ruled is a critical aspect of modern liberal understanding of sovereignty. However, sovereignty has roots in the violence and conflicts that often initially led to the establishment of sovereign states. Sovereignty is a concept that has been developed over time in the work of influential theorists such as Thomas Hobbes and is understood in different ways by different perspectives. For instance, realists argue that states are independent and act in their own interest, whereas liberals emphasize that the states can operate in order to pursue mutual benefits. Changes to sovereignty from development above the nation state, such as growing influence and supranational institutions in the European Union, were explored. Changes from below the nation state were also discussed, such as the rise of secessionist movements and the development of new networked virtual communities. Political ideas and ideologies. Chapter 9, The Messy World of Ideology. Introduction. Ideology has been long a familiar term in politics, signifying the distinctive principles, values, opinions, and arguments that separate political groups, parties, and movements. As such, it is a fundamental part of the contested nature of politics. Conflicts, disagreements, wars, and revolutions have to varying degrees been fought out over ideology. Marxist ideology in Eastern Europe, religious fundamentalism in the Middle East, fascism in Italy, and Nazism in Germany can all be cited as prime examples of ideological politics. This is largely because of the all-encompassing critics of revolutionary, radical, or machinery, the theoretic used by their leaders, and the propaganda techniques and mobilization of opinion used in campaigns. Ideological conflict defined many of the key political events of the 20th century and is sometimes summed up by expressions such as the clash of civilizations. A battle of heart and minds and Cold War theoretic. However, as we shall see, ideology concerns not merely the extremes, but also less adversarial politics, the everyday business of debate and discussion, the implementation of policy and the running of elections. Though moderates and pragmatists are often said to be without ideological sympathies, all political actors possess some core beliefs, which define what they stand for and may influence their political behaviour. The causes they espouse and the interests they defend. Chapters 9 to 12 will consider the view of political ideologies are not merely found on the margins, but are crucial to the mainstream of politics. Moreover, it is in the nature of the political ideologies that they adapt and modify, drawing on ideas from a range of influences. Ideologies live and are consistently remade in different circumstances in chapter 9 to 12. We will consider how they have done so in the contemporary UK. The modern origins of our ideology lie in the 18th century French Enlightenment and its aftermath, when Antoine Destat de Tracy first used the term in a series of papers of the 1790s, which he later developed in his book, The Elements of Ideology, 1817. His first use of the term indicated some four meanings which still have relevance today. Ideology as science of ideas, which reflected the optimism of the enlightenment of the ideas, can have a demonstrable and progressive impact on shaping the development of society. Ideology as a reflection of secure liberal republicanism, free from religious suppositions and shared by intellectuals or scientists. Ideology as the expression of dangerous radicalism. Ideology as the generic term of political doctrine, as outlined by Vincent, 1992. This early application of ideology as a way of understanding the changing world and providing perspectives on what should be done about it occurred right at the beginning of the period. In the late 18th century and into the first half of the 19th century, when the new political movements emerged in Europe on the back of major industrial political upheavals, though ideology in this period did not operate within the hierarchical political framework or later 20th century mass political parties, there were some parties that can be identified and which broadly confirmed Destat de Tracy's view that ideology could have significant impact in shaping social change. They were evident in Britain, for example, in movements like Chartism, which campaigned for universal suffrage, and the Conservative Party under Disraeli and Chamberlain, which its social reform agenda. Subsequently, ideology was important in the emergence of political organisations like Labour Party and in the claims of the suffragettes and the early development of feminism in the early part of the 20th century. While we may find Destat de Tracy's sciences of ideas too rigid for an understanding of the complex and messy world of contemporary ideologies. His view that ideologies enabled an understanding of societies based on reason and science rather than religious assumptions was important, as was his belief that ideology helped the trajectory towards forms of self-government. This is his emphasis on ideology as a form of secure liberal republicanism. Through this step, de Tracy did not reduce ideology to extremism. As some later writers have done, he did make the connection with the extremes. The growth of Italian fascism, the first modern mass ideology movement in Italy, was an early 20th century example. Italian fascism, Nazism in Germany, and Soviet communism all used propaganda and to control private spheres in a dissemination of their ideologies, and this contributed to an association of ideology with the extremes of the left to right. However, ideology also had a role in the opposition to these regimes and the defence of the Western liberal values, as well as behind the more moderate reform agendas of post-war Europe, perhaps confirming de Tracy's final point on the acceptance of ideology as the generic term for political doctrine. 1945 Labour government in the UK, for example, is often cited in an ideology turning point because of the significant social reforms associated with welfare, such as the introduction of the National Health Service and its nationalisation programme, which brought the ideas which sustained them, caused the phrase post-war settlement. While most of their reforms were partly inspired by liberal and socialist ideologies, they were subsequently endorsed and modified by later governments for their conservative ideology. This reflects the fact that, for the most part, the ideological world in the UK has been dominated by three broad traditions encompassing various elements of conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, while it has been influenced further by more radical traditions such as feminism and environmentalism, notably since the 1960s, as well as various types of nationalism. From this, it is possible to begin to discern the central role ideologies have and continue to have UK politics, as Michael Frieden, one of the leading academic authorities on political ideology, puts it. Ideologies map the political social world for us. We simply cannot do without them because we cannot act without making sense of the worlds we inhabit. Making sense, let it be said, does not always mean making good or right sense, but ideologies will often contain a lot of common sense. At any rate, political facts never speak for themselves through our diverse ideologies. We provide competing interpretations of what the facts might mean. Every interpretation, each ideology, is one such instance of imposing a pattern, some form of structure or organisation on how we read and misread political facts, events, occurrences, actions, on how we see images and hear voices. I'll leave that there. Page 266, grade 8, so I do.